Hello, and welcome once again to our consideration of the upcoming scripture readings for the fifth Sunday of the Lenten season. This, of course, is what we call the C year, the year in which our principal gospel guide is Luke. Now, the readings for this time, first reading from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 43, verses 16 through 21, from the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 8 to 14. And now, the gospel is from the gospel according to John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. So one might smile a moment and say, wait a minute, if this is the year of Luke, what are we doing with the gospel reading from John? The particular section chosen for this week is an interesting story. Apparently a story that floated around in the early Christian churches. And it's recorded in a couple of what we would say non-scriptural places as an incident that happened in Jesus' time. Why it is found in the Gospel of John is a much disputed and debated issue. In some ways, the story, now what is the story itself, so to kind of know what we're talking about, is that there is a woman who is taken in adultery and brought before Jesus, who the leaders want him to pass judgment. Now, the story itself certainly in many ways has the characteristics of a Lucan account, namely where Jesus is pictured as showing mercy and forgiveness, which would fit the general theme as we are looking at the Lucan tradition. On the other hand, it fits John in a certain way, and one needs to look now where this particular episode is placed in the gospel tradition of John. Chapter 7, which precedes this, pictures Jesus as teaching in the Jerusalem temple area. And there are groups kind of listening to what he is saying, what he is proclaiming. And the leadership in Jerusalem are not happy with what is happening with regard to Jesus' teaching. Namely, he is gathering around him a number of followers, or at least listeners, and some of the things which Jesus is suggesting challenges the leaders. Now again, in John's Gospel, one must be very careful that the term, and we've used this before, or noticed this before, and we will again, that the term Jews, as used in John's Gospel, does not refer to Judaism in general, but refers to a particular group of Jews who would probably be the leadership, particularly in Jerusalem. They are concerned with the popularity of Jesus, and so they are looking ways to thwart him, to make him look bad in the eyes of his contemporaries. So here's the setting. Jesus has been teaching, chapter 7. He's been speaking about the light that is to come into the world. He has cured a blind man. And now, this episode with regard to this woman. So all of this is to say that this is a very unusual textual history here. It's not found, by the way, in many of the early manuscripts of the Gospels. And it does bear, however, some similarities in the episode that unfolds to the Susanna story, which is found in the book of Daniel, in the latter part of that book. Now, once again, the book of Daniel has 12 chapters, and then has 2 additional chapters, which are found in the Vulgate version, which is the version that we as Catholics tend to use. So not all Bibles will have this story. But the story of Susanna, you'll remember, or may at least quickly review it, is that there is, Susanna is the wife of a prominent Jewish leader. After the meeting one day that he has with his contemporaries, he leaves, and the two of the Jewish, well, actually they're men in position, they're elders, lust for Susanna. Now, she decides to take a bath in the afternoon in a garden. They hide out, and of course you get the story. It's very kind of colorful and interesting. And they, of course, approach her to try to do some things. She refuses. They therefore scream out. They accuse her of doing something wrong and bring her up for trial. And because of what they say, she is liable to be killed. Well, at the last minute, as she is being led away to some kind of execution, a young prophet, of course the book is named Daniel says, wait a minute, let's check this out. And he then says, I would like to interview each of the elders individually, which he does, and he asks, well, under what tree did this inappropriate action take place? One says one tree, the other says a different tree, and Daniel points out that they have lied. She is saved, and Daniel emerges as certainly a hero. The just woman, and she is just, is saved. Now, there are a number of similarities to this gospel episode to that particular event. So I mention all of this because the gospel writer John is particularly aware of Old Testament thinking, but then again, the writer Luke is not unaware of those things, which leads to, we're making a short story long here, which leads to great debate as to exactly where this belongs. But for now, it appears in the Gospel of John, but since it's the year of Luke, it is an appropriate kind of reflection on this fifth week of the Lenten time. Jesus is pictured as teaching in the temple, and the Pharisees and scribes bring in a woman who is caught in the act of adultery. Now, they then say to Jesus, and they bring her in and make her stand in front of all of those who are gathered around. Kind of use her as an object. She is someone who has done wrong. They all know she's done wrong. Jesus is not unaware that she has done something wrong. But the leaders then say to Jesus, what punishment should she be given? Now, there was a tradition, and is a tradition. It's found in the book of Deuteronomy, again, one of the books in the famous opening 5, which say that if adultery is committed, the two who are responsible for this are to be stoned. So it's one of the few places in the Bible where this problem or process of stoning is suggested. However, there are, of course, a lot of anomalies here. The woman has been caught in the act of adultery. If both partners are to be stoned, where is the male partner? So once again, there is a whole kind of question of male. Why, in fact, is the crime of adultery that? Because, and this could only take place, really be an act of adultery, if the woman herself were married. If it were a virgin or a woman, a maiden who was not married, then technically this can't be an adultery. Because what a married woman having relationships with another man, assuming he is also married, affects the property of the husband. So see how this is. that the wife is really considered to be, in a certain way, the property of the man. If, therefore, she engages in an act of intercourse with another man who is also married, two things happen. The honor of the man, namely of the husband, both husbands, is dishonored, and therefore some kind of punishment needs to be merited out. So there's a lot of cultural background here that makes this story different and something to consider. There are a lot of questions here that are really posed. For example, was the husband of the wife, his wife, setting her up? Was she the victim of a plot? Because, for whatever reasons, he didn't want it to consider her to be his wife anymore. And so, is she really guilty of a crime of adultery, or is she innocent? However, to put it into correct perspective, even if the husband did know the failings of his wife and knew full well that in this case she would have to be killed, or was set up, and did his enemies do this to the man in order to get to him? You can see there's a lot of colorful drama here in this particular episode. Now they pose the question to Jesus. What do we do? Do we carry out what the law says? Now it's really a test. Let me point out that although it seems to be a test of the woman, it may really be a setup on the part of the scribes and Pharisees here to set up Jesus. Is he really the target of this particular event because they don't like what he has been teaching? Now they know that if Jesus says, well, I guess she needs to be stoned, that the Romans had issued a rule that the only ones who could sentence anyone to death would be the Roman government itself. So if Jesus says, oh, go ahead and stone her, then he puts himself in opposition to Roman authority and could be arrested, and maybe that's one way they would get rid of him. If, however, Jesus does not say that and suggests something else, then isn't he going against the Hebrew or Jewish tradition? Isn't he not letting something which is wrong happen? If he decides to show mercy, well, that's nice, but he breaks the Jewish tradition. So it looks like they have him now in a rather perfect trap, if you want. One way he can't say this, and another way he can't say this. So let's hear what he's going to do. Let's see if we don't, in this way, disgrace him. Of course, it's a question of honor. Therefore, he's supporting dishonor by his actions. What's he going to do? What Jesus does, you remember, and again, notice how woman here is used almost objectively, stand there, and all of the crowd around her kind of look at her, and you know, this one, who is she and what does she deserve? Jesus bends down and writes on the ground with his finger. Now, this, of course, has given rise to much speculation. What exactly was Jesus doing as he is writing? Now, some say, and keep in mind that no one knows what he is writing at all, okay, in the dust. There probably would have been dust and dirt in the temple area at this time, because, as we have mentioned on an occasion, the temple was being redone, that the aegis of under the Herod the Great had ordered that the whole platform of the temple be redone. And so there was a lot of construction going on, which would leave, by the way, stones laying around, as well as dirt. Those of you who have been into building know that this, of course, is very common. So what is he writing in the dust or in the dirt? Cecil B. DeMille, who, of course, in a movie called The King of Kings, his first one, years ago, said that Jesus was writing in the dust Aramaic words lust, greed, extortion, and therefore suggesting that those who were guilty of this might want to look at what's going on. Well, others say he's writing the sins of those who are the accusers of the woman, and therefore kind of shaming them, bringing dishonor to them. Notice that these two qualities of honor and shame are at work here. Another possibility is that simply Jesus is wasting time. Now, you can't waste time, but using time here. Notice that some of you in the old days, when you used to have a telephone, not the pocket one you use now, but on the wall, kind of stationary, and you were talking to someone, and they were talking for a long time, and you were, what am I going to do? Might have been just doodling on a piece of paper, kind of scribbling away. Well, maybe that's what Jesus is doing. Nothing happens. Jesus then stands up, not looking at anyone. What's very important here is Jesus does not try to stare people down, but suggests to those who are there that those who are without sin are the ones who should first cast the stone, or cast the first stone. Now Jesus is transferring the responsibility for what happens to this woman from a decision that he will make to a decision that they will make. And then he stoops down on the ground and continues to do the writing. Now, what the gospel narrator points out is that they began to leave the scene, beginning with the oldest and moving down to the younger. Now, this, by the way, is the reverse of what way things would happen. Usually, the youngest would lead first, because with the older leading, the thought was the younger would follow the example of the older. But in this case, that's exactly what happens. The older accusers in the ground or in the area begin to leave. And one would assume that not only were the leaders who were making this accusation the ones who were leaving, but also the larger group who were standing around the woman also began to leave. So that, after a period of time, Jesus stands up, looks around, and notices that no one is there. And then says to the woman, "Is here no one here to judge you?" And she says, "No." And Jesus then says, "Neither did I. Go." Now it's interesting that this may well have been the initial words that Jesus would have used with the woman. Because in the text that we're going to read this time, Jesus is then pictured, "Go and sin no more." Now that's all well and good, because she has been caught in a sin. But as soon as Jesus says, "Go and sin no more," isn't Jesus now himself passing judgment? And earlier on, Jesus had said, "Who am I to judge?" So although it's very often interpreted, and I'm sure some of the homilies that we will hear, picture Jesus as saying, "Neither will I, then go and sin no more," by making that kind of advice, has not Jesus himself passed a certain judgment on the woman? So there's a great deal of ambiguity in certain ways about this particular account. But Jesus, as I said, says to the woman, "I do not condemn you." And from now on, well, there's a kind of little maybe change that's understanding a little bit. From now on, do not sin. And here's where another word is added in some of the text, again. See, so that one of the kind of problems here is the question of judgment. Neither do I condemn you, where Jesus says, neither do I judge you. So there is, in all of this, and you could make a homily here, and you won't hear this on a homily, I think, kind of contradiction here as to what Jesus is exactly saying. So this woman, whatever she has done, backing up a little bit, adding a few more points to this rather interesting narrative, where exactly did this happen? Now, if you are guilty of adultery, you must be caught in the very act of adultery. Now, are we to assume that the woman and the man were committing the act of adultery on the front lawn, so that when the leaders went by, they immediately saw this going on and therefore could be witness to it? Or, no offense here, were they kind of peeping Toms? After all, this kind of action would most likely be done in a house and away from the ordinary observation of people. So did they notice this because they were watching? So that's another kind of way. How come they are able to capture her in the very act of committing adultery? Further, going back to a point raised earlier, how come the man is not brought? How does he get away with it? How does he simply, does he pay a little fine maybe and that's it? But where is he? So there's a contradiction also in the whole process in that regard. But as I mentioned, it really seems, although the woman is the one who is put on trial, if you want, brought into the midst of the community, one would point out that it really seems that the trap is being set for Jesus. Now, Jesus doesn't take a side here, does he? He doesn't say, stone her. He doesn't say, don't stone her. He said, if you want to stone her, let the one who is innocent of any sin throw the first stone. Obviously, he's hitting to the heart of what people are thinking, what position people are in. Who is sinless, I suppose. I know, some would say, I'm an example of that. Well, good for you. But most of us would have to be more honest in that regard. So this particular episode finds Jesus as triumphing over the test that is posed to him and winning the trial that the leadership is trying to put him or make him face. Now, this episode, as I say, fits where Jesus had been teaching, and people liked him. And this story now inserted at the very end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8, as chapter 8 begins, which we will not hear in John's Gospel, picks up again, where Jesus illustrates by his teaching the importance of light and being able to see. And in the Johannine tradition, there's a great deal of back and forth about seeing and not seeing and understanding and who understands. But in a culture of honor and shame, one notices here that Jesus has defended that. He's defended the honor of the woman. And he's also defended the honor of the accusers. He's not brought them into trial. And the fact, one notices, if one wants, that Jesus looks down. He doesn't try to stare people into, see, are you innocent? Are you not without sin? Are you one who would cast the first stone? So there's this kind of quality of Jesus that the Lucan tradition likes, where Jesus is one who supports the idea of compassion, of mercy, of forgiveness. Not that the Johannine Gospel isn't interested in that, but that is not a prime concern of the stories of John. By the way, the term compassion does not appear in the Johannine Gospel, but it frequently appears certainly in the Lucan Gospel. So that's why this episode seems to relate here. I suppose other questions that one could raise here is how do we think about the fact that this woman belonged to her husband? So you see, it's a very patriarchal society in which Jesus lived. Are the gospel passages, this would be one example of them, in some ways challenging that, suggesting the dignity and the honor that belongs to the woman? Now, admittedly, she's done a wrong, but nevertheless, even because of that, is not abandoned by God's compassion, is not to be abandoned by others. So there's another kind of question there. Some point out that this woman was a type of a woman. What does that mean? Well, a woman who engaged in this kind of activity. Notice that sometimes, depending on who the interpreters are, who the reflectors are, kind of assume certain things, write or read certain things into the story. So all of that is kind of a very powerful story of Jesus, who disregards proper protocol, who speaks to the woman. And by the way, as a kind of point here, remember that women in society were not to speak, and men did not, in public society, that is, speak to a woman. Jesus here speaks to her. Now again, we might not pay attention to that because we're so used to other things, but notice how that plays out in this gospel. Earlier on, Jesus had spoken to a Samaritan woman at the well, and she had observed that, you know, you guys do not speak to us. And yet Jesus here, that's what I mean by he breaks protocol by speaking to the woman. And she in turn says, dialogue, there's no one here to condemn you. And she says, no. So putting together different aspects, or different ways rather, in which this account might be considered, keep in mind those two qualities of honor and shame. Jesus, in a way, honors all of those, even his adversaries, by not causing them to be dishonored. And he avoids shaming any of them, and that's why it's perhaps interesting that I would say when he's kind of writing in the dust, not calling to task anyone, but simply giving them an opportunity to gracefully leave the scene without causing any further harm or hurt. Therefore, no one is shamed. So the two kind of values here at work are respected in this narration. So all of that, again, how would you answer this might be the question, because some would say, if Jesus doesn't say get her, then isn't he advocating that it's all right to do this? See, so others would say, oh, it's all very nice that he's very kind to her, but therefore he's kind of approving of this. He's not doing that. But again, notice that this single episode can raise a number of different kind of questions or areas for discussion and concern. Be that as it may, in a wonderful way, Jesus refuses, if you want, to play the game of being a judge, of accusing, and rather exercises the quality that we all hope to receive from the Lord, frequently his compassion, and the quality that he hopes others who read this gospel will also be showing to others. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you soon.